The hospital seemed darker at night, a giant of concrete and steel towering against the black sky. Its weathered facade, marked by time, reflected the pale glow of the streetlights, casting strange shadows on the walls. John, a young, freshly graduated doctor, clutched his white coat tightly around himself as he crossed the main gate. The cold of the early morning cut into his skin, but he wasn't sure if it was the biting wind or the nervousness making his hands tremble. It was his first night shift, and John felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. São Vicente Hospital was known for its old structure and for the stories that the older staff would tell in the hallways. Rumors of dimly lit corridors where time seemed to drag, and rooms where patients whispered to themselves about things that no one else could see. As he walked through the silent corridors, John noticed how different the hospital felt at night. During the day, the constant flow of people gave the place a sense of life. But now, in the dead of night, everything seemed stagnant, as if the hospital had been ripped from time and left there, trapped in a bubble of darkness and solitude. The sound of his footsteps echoed strangely loud in the empty corridors. He struggled to ignore the growing sense of unease, repeating to himself that it was just the fatigue and nervousness of starting his career. But there was something in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. When he reached the doctor's lounge, John found only one nurse, Laura, flipping through an old magazine. She looked up as he entered and smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "First night?" she asked in a hoarse, tired voice. John nodded, trying to appear more confident than he felt. "Yes, first night shift. Anything I should know?" Laura let out a long sigh, as if she were about to recount a long story, but she only shook her head. "Just do your job and try not to get lost in the corridors. This place has its secrets." Before he could ask anything else, the nurse stood up and left the room, leaving John alone with his thoughts. He looked around the room, noticing how the walls seemed too close, as if they were trying to squeeze him in. With a sigh, he picked up his clipboard and began reviewing the patient charts he would be attending to that night. But no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Something lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The clock on the wall read 11:45 p.m. The night had just begun, and John had no idea what he was about to face. The clock struck midnight when John was called to the emergency room. The call echoed through the empty corridors of the hospital, a sound that seemed louder and more urgent in the stillness of the night. He took a deep breath, trying to control the anxiety that was beginning to build in his chest, and hurried to the emergency wing. When he arrived, he was met with the sight of Laura, the nurse he had met earlier, with a serious expression on her face. She stood beside a stretcher where a man lay motionless, covered by a sheet. The patient seemed unconscious, but there was something disturbing about his presence. "He was found at the entrance of the hospital, no documents, nothing to identify him," Laura said, without taking her eyes off the man on the stretcher. "The security guard said he just appeared, like he came out of nowhere." John approached slowly, analyzing the man. He was middle-aged, with distressed features and deep scars on his face. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as if life were draining out of him. The young doctor tried to find vital signs, but everything seemed strangely normal, except for the fact that the patient's breathing was extremely irregular. "Any signs of trauma?" John asked as he checked the vital signs again, trying to find an explanation for the man's condition. "None," Laura replied, her voice sounding distant. "But he was mumbling something when they brought him in. Nonsense. He seemed haunted." John frowned. He had seen cases of people in shock before, but there was something different about this man, something he couldn't identify, but that stirred a sense of discomfort in his chest. As he examined the patient, he noticed something curious. The man was clutching a small crumpled piece of paper in his left hand. John carefully opened the patient's hand and took the paper, unfolding it. What he found left him perplexed. It was a piece of a map, hastily scribbled, with a point marked right in the center of the hospital. There was no explanation, just a strange symbol drawn next to the point, something John couldn't decipher. "What do you think this means?" he asked, showing the paper to Laura. She looked at the paper for a moment, her expression becoming even more serious. "I've never seen this symbol before, but I don't like it. This hospital has a long history, Doctor. Some things that happened here. Well, maybe it's better not to dig too deep." John felt a shiver run down his spine. He tried to shake off the irrational fear that was beginning to take hold of his thoughts, but the heavy silence and oppressive atmosphere of the hospital made it almost impossible. "Let's monitor the patient and try to find out more about him," John said, trying to sound professional despite the knot forming in his throat. "We need to know how he got here and what happened before." As John finished adjusting the IV in the man's vein, he felt Laura's gaze on him. When he looked up, he saw that she seemed to be observing something beyond him, something he couldn't see. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there, just the thick shadows of the dark corridors. "Be careful, Doctor," Laura murmured, almost like a whisper. "Sometimes the things that come in here never leave." The night was far from over, and John was beginning to realize that there was much more to this hospital than he could have imagined. The hours passed slowly after the admission of the mysterious patient. John couldn't get the strange symbol on the piece of paper and Laura's unsettling words out of his mind. Determined to find out more, he headed to the records room, intent on finding some clue about the man's identity. The records room was a small, stuffy space, with old shelves crammed with dusty folders. The smell of aged paper and mold hung in the air. John began sifting through the files, searching for any information that might shed light on the unknown patient. However, the more he searched, the more frustrated he became. The files seemed incomplete, and curiously, there was no entry record for the patient. It was as if he had never been officially admitted. The hospital's outdated computer system, which barely functioned, offered no answers either. The patient's name, if he had one, was nowhere to be found. "This doesn't make sense," John muttered to himself as he flipped through the pages of an old file, hoping to find some clue. Suddenly, he noticed something strange. A folder tucked away at the back of one of the shelves, covered in dust, as if it hadn't been touched in years. There was something unusual about it, something that caught his attention. When he picked it up, he noticed it was labeled with a name he had never heard before, Edson Cordero. Curious, John opened the folder and began reading the documents. They belonged to a man who had apparently been admitted to the hospital many years earlier with mysterious symptoms. As he read, John felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The symptoms described in the documents were eerily similar to those of the patient he had treated earlier that night: irregular breathing, pale skin, and inexplicable scars. But there was something even more disturbing. According to the records, Edson Cordero had disappeared from the hospital without a trace. The last entry in the chart mentioned an acute crisis during the night, after which the patient simply vanished, with no one seeing or hearing anything. John began to feel a tightness in his chest. The name of the doctor in charge of the case also caught his attention: Dr. Albert Santiago. He vaguely remembered hearing the name in some conversation, but couldn't recall exactly where. As he was about to close the folder, a piece of paper fell to the floor. It was a handwritten note, almost illegible, but John managed to decipher a few words. The symbol: Room 23. Secret of the Ancients. Beware, Albert. John felt a chill run down his spine. The symbol mentioned was the same one he had seen on the piece of paper held by the mysterious patient. The mention of Room 23 also disturbed him, as, to his knowledge, there was no room with that number in the hospital. He had walked through the hospital during his first days and was certain of it. Intrigued and with his mind filled with questions, John put the documents back in the folder and decided to seek more information about Room 23 and Dr. Albert Santiago. He felt that he was getting close to something big, something that perhaps was better left buried. But his curiosity and sense of duty as a doctor compelled him to continue. As he left the records room, John noticed that the corridors were darker than before. The lights flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He looked around, expecting to see Laura or another staff member, but he was completely alone. The feeling of being watched returned with full force, and he quickened his pace, heading to the doctor's lounge. As he passed through the main corridor, a low sound, almost a whisper, made him stop. It seemed to come from one of the empty rooms, but when John turned to look, he saw nothing but darkness. "I need to figure out what's going on here," he muttered to himself, his heart pounding. The night was far from over, and John found himself increasingly immersed in a dark and unsettling mystery from which there might be no return. The hospital, with its ancient secrets and shadowy corridors, seemed alive, pulsating with a malevolent energy he could barely comprehend. With the documents of Edson Cordero still fresh in his mind, John returned to the doctor's lounge, his mind racing with unanswered questions. He needed to understand what was happening in that hospital and, more importantly, find out who the mysterious patient was, who had appeared without explanation. When he entered the room, he expected to find Laura or another staff member on duty, but the space was empty. The only light came from a flickering fluorescent lamp, which emitted a soft, irritating buzz. The loneliness of the hospital at night was beginning to weigh on him, bringing a growing discomfort to the surface. John sat down in a chair, trying to organize his thoughts, but before he could focus, the door to the room slowly opened without a sound. He looked up and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was Laura. Something was different about her, though John couldn't quite identify what it was. Her eyes seemed vacant, almost as if they were looking through him, and her skin, already pale, was even more devoid of color. She entered the room without saying a word, moving with an unsettling slowness, almost as if she were in a trance. "Laura, are you all right?" John asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she walked over to the table, picked up a coffee mug that was there, and stared intently at the liquid, as if seeing something within it. The silence between them became oppressive, and John felt the need to break it. "I found some old documents about a patient named Edson Cordero. He had symptoms very similar to the man we treated earlier. Do you know anything about this?" Laura slowly lifted her eyes, and a strange, unsettling smile formed on her lips. "Edson, he also tried to uncover this place's secrets," she said, her voice sounding distant, almost like an echo. "But some things should not be discovered, Doctor. The hospital, it keeps its own stories." The way she spoke left John uneasy. Laura's voice seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before, something that made the room feel smaller, suffocating. He tried to continue the conversation, hoping to get some clear answers, but the nurse abruptly turned and left the room without another word, leaving John alone with his thoughts. "This is getting stranger by the minute," he muttered, standing up to follow her. When he reached the corridor, Laura was already gone. He followed, hearing her footsteps echo on the linoleum floor. The lights continued to flicker intermittently, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. John felt that something was very wrong, but he couldn't pull away, as if an invisible force compelled him to follow the nurse. Laura turned a corner, and when John caught up, she was standing in front of a door he had never noticed before. The sign next to it read, "Room 23. John's blood ran cold. He was sure that room hadn't been there before. How could it just appear out of nowhere? The nurse stood in front of the door for a moment before finally turning to John. Her eyes, once vacant, were now fixed on him with an almost supernatural intensity. "You shouldn't be here, Doctor," she said, in a tone that sent a wave of panic through John's body. "No one should." Before he could respond, Laura opened the door to room 23 and entered, disappearing into the darkness beyond. John stood there, frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. Everything inside him screamed not to go in, to stay away from that place. But curiosity, mixed with a sense of duty, pushed him forward. Taking a deep breath, John stepped forward and entered room 23. The room was small and claustrophobic, illuminated only by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered in damp stains, and there was an old, worn table in the center with various papers scattered on it. However, what caught John's attention the most was the figure standing at the back of the room. It was Laura, or at least it seemed to be. But something was terribly wrong. Her eyes were now completely white, with no pupils, and her skin appeared to have become translucent, almost spectral. She smiled again, that strange smile he had seen before, but this time she seemed to be disintegrating, as if she were dissolving before his eyes. John felt panic rising in his throat. He stepped back, but the door behind him closed on its own, locking him inside the room with the figure that was no longer Laura. "The hospital keeps its secrets," the figure whispered, its voice now a distorted echo. "And you, Doctor, are part of them now." Before he could react, the lights flickered violently, and the room plunged into total darkness. All John could hear was a low, chilling laugh that seemed to come from all directions at once. When the lights finally returned, the room was empty. There was no sign of Laura, and the door was unlocked. But John knew that something very real and very dangerous was happening in that hospital. Something he could barely comprehend, but that was drawing him deeper into its grasp. Still panting, he left room 23, determined to find answers, and quickly before it was too late. John left room 23 with his heart racing, feeling as if he had just emerged from a vivid nightmare. His hands were trembling, and he could barely focus as he walked through the hospital's empty corridors. Every shadow seemed to hide a secret. Every distant sound made his mind race to the worst possible scenarios. He needed answers, but he knew that to get them, he would have to confront whatever was lurking in that cursed place. Determined not to let fear overwhelm him, John decided to investigate the stories surrounding the hospital more deeply. He remembered Laura mentioning that the hospital kept its secrets, and he couldn't help but think that room 23 was just the tip of the iceberg. Something bigger and more sinister was buried in that place, something that had been hidden for decades. John headed to the hospital's archive room, a place that, according to the older staff, held documents and records that no one wanted to remember. The room was located in the basement, in a wing that was rarely visited except out of extreme necessity. When he reached the rusty door of the archive, he felt a chill run down his spine, as if the air there was heavier, filled with years of forgotten stories. With a flashlight in hand, he entered the archive, illuminating the shelves filled with dusty cardboard boxes and forgotten folders. The smell of mold was almost suffocating, and the silence was so absolute that the sound of his own footsteps seemed to echo throughout the room. John began to search through the documents, trying to find any clue that could help him understand what was happening. After hours of fruitless searching, he finally found something that caught his attention: an old folder marked with the symbol he had seen on the piece of paper held by the mysterious patient. The symbol was hand-drawn on the cover of the folder with thick, irregular lines, as if it had been done in haste. The folder was labeled with the name Room 23 and a warning written in bold letters: "Confidential, restricted access." John felt a shiver run down his spine as he opened the folder. Inside, there were a series of old documents, many of which appeared to be medical reports dating back several decades. As he read, he began to understand that Room 23 had a much darker history than he could have imagined. The documents described a series of medical experiments conducted on patients deemed irrecoverable. These people, many of whom were admitted for severe psychiatric disorders, were subjected to highly experimental and often inhumane procedures. The purpose of the experiments was never entirely clear in the documents, but something seemed to indicate that the doctors involved believed they were on the verge of a revolutionary discovery, something that justified the horrible means they were using. Among the documents, John found the name of Dr. Albert Santiago once again. He was the one responsible for the experiments, and the record suggested that he believed he was dealing with forces that transcended traditional science. John couldn't understand everything described in the reports, but one thing was clear. The experiments were dangerous, and the patients who survived them were never the same again. One of the documents mentioned a particular event that occurred in room 23. During one of the experiments, a patient had begun exhibiting strange behaviors, claiming to be in contact with something beyond this world. The document suggested that after the incident, the room was sealed off and kept secret, accessible only to a few trusted doctors. The hospital had done its best to cover up the event, but rumors continued to circulate among the staff over the years. John was so absorbed in the documents that he almost didn't notice when the lights in the archive began to flicker. He looked around, feeling a presence in the room with him. The air grew colder, and he could hear a faint whisper, as if someone was speaking directly into his ear. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear, a warning, or perhaps a threat. Trying to stay calm, John closed the folder and placed it back on the shelf. He knew he was meddling in something dangerous, but he also knew he needed to uncover the truth. When he turned to leave the archive, the door he had left slightly ajar was now completely closed. Fear gripped his body, but he mustered the courage to walk toward the door, trying to open it. The doorknob was cold to the touch, and when he turned it, the door opened with a long, ominous creak. On the other side, the corridor was pitch black, except for a faint light flickering in the distance. John felt his heart race as he slowly walked down the corridor, trying not to look at the shadows that seemed to move at the edges of his vision. When he finally reached the end of the corridor, he realized that the light was coming from a small room on the left. The door was ajar, and a rusty sign indicated the name, Room of Ancient Instruments. John hesitated for a moment before entering. The room was filled with old medical instruments, many of which he could barely recognize. There were scalpels, saws, and other metal tools that looked more like torture devices than medical equipment. But what caught his attention was a leather-bound journal sitting on a table in the center of the room. John picked up the journal with trembling hands and opened it. The pages were covered with handwritten notes, with hurried and, in some places, almost illegible letters. The journal seemed to belong to Dr. Albert Santiago, and the last entries were disturbing. The experiments have gone too far. We are dealing with something we cannot understand. The hospital is cursed, and room 23 is the epicenter. I need to seal the room once and for all, but I fear it is already too late. The entities we awakened, they cannot be contained. The last entry was dated a few days before Dr. Santiago's disappearance. After that, the pages were blank. John felt a deep dread take hold of his soul. He knew that by entering room 23, he had crossed a line he should not have crossed. The entities Dr. Santiago mentioned were still there, and he had disturbed them. With the journal in hand, John left the room of ancient instruments, determined to find out more about Dr. Santiago's fate and how he might somehow contain the evil that haunted the hospital. He knew that from that moment on, he was not just fighting for answers. He was fighting for his own survival. Still shaken by what he had discovered in the archive, John walked back to the doctor's lounge, feeling the weight of the revelations he now carried. Dr. Albert Santiago's journal, with its dark descriptions and sinister warnings, seemed to burn in his hands. He knew he couldn't ignore what he had read, but with every step he took through the empty corridors, the feeling of being watched grew, as if the hospital was reacting to his discoveries. When he finally reached the doctor's lounge, he collapsed into a chair, trying to calm his nerves. The overhead light continued to flicker intermittently, and the constant buzzing filled the oppressive silence of the room. He opened the journal again, rereading the last entries, trying to find something that could help him understand how to deal with the situation. That's when the phone in the room rang. John jumped, the unexpected sound slicing through the silence like a sharp blade. For a moment, he hesitated. The phone never rang at that hour of the night, and there was something disturbing about the shrill sound echoing through the empty room. However, he knew he couldn't ignore the call. Taking a deep breath, he stood up and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" His voice came out more trembling than he would have liked. On the other end, there was only silence. A silence so deep it seemed to swallow everything around him. John felt a shiver run down his spine. He was about to hang up when he heard a faint whisper, almost inaudible. "John." The doctor froze. The sound was low, distorted, but he recognized his own name being called. It was a female voice, filled with despair and fear. John's heart began to beat faster. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice now firmer, though his heart was racing. There was a pause, followed by an even weaker whisper. "Help me. Room 23. They are here." The line went dead, and then, abruptly, the phone disconnected. John stood there, holding the receiver tightly, feeling the cold sweat in his hands. The sense of panic he had been trying to suppress was returning with full force. Whoever it was knew he had been in room 23, and worse, it seemed like they were asking for help. He hung up the phone and backed away, looking around the room as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows at any moment. The mention of room 23 left him uneasy, but there was something else in that voice, something familiar he couldn't identify. He knew he couldn't just ignore the call, but at the same time, the fear of returning to that room nearly paralyzed him. Trying to think logically, John remembered Dr. Santiago's journal. Maybe there was something in the notes that could help him understand what was happening. He flipped through the pages, desperately searching for some clue on how to deal with the entities mentioned. But the more he read, the more it became clear that even Dr. Santiago had not found a solution. "The entities are beyond our comprehension. They are not of this world, but of something much older and darker. I tried to contain them, but I failed. I don't know how much longer we can maintain the facade of the hospital functioning normally. I feel they are getting stronger, feeding off the fear and suffering of the patients. My only advice is to avoid room 23 at all costs." Santiago's words seemed like a final warning, but at the same time, John felt that running away was not an option. Someone or something was calling him, and he knew he couldn't ignore the plea for help. He needed to go back to room 23 despite the risk. With a heavy heart, John closed the journal and tucked it into the pocket of his white coat. He knew that the only way to understand what was happening was to confront the evil that inhabited that place directly. If Dr. Santiago had failed, perhaps John could at least discover what was truly at stake there. Mustered his courage, John left the doctor's lounge and began walking through the dark corridors toward room 23. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as if the hospital itself was resisting his advance. The lights continued to flicker, creating a shadow play that distorted his perception of the environment. When he finally reached the door of room 23, he stopped, feeling the air around him grow even colder. He extended his trembling hand toward the doorknob, but before he could turn it, he heard a low, disturbing sound, like something scratching the other side of the door. Taking a deep breath, John opened the door, bracing himself for whatever was waiting for him. The room was as dark as before, but this time he noticed a change. In the corner of the room, a figure was sitting, motionless, with its head bowed. "Hello?" John called, his voice echoing in the darkness. The figure didn't move, but he could hear the sound of heavy, irregular breathing, as if the person was struggling to breathe. With a trembling flashlight in hand, he took a step forward, illuminating the figure. It was a woman, dressed in a nurse's uniform, the same type of uniform that Laura wore. She slowly lifted her head, revealing a pale, cadaverous face with sunken eyes that seemed full of pain and despair. When her eyes met John's, he realized that this was the same woman who had called him. "You need to leave this place," the woman murmured, her voice a faint whisper. "They are here. They will never let you leave." Before John could respond, the woman began to fade before his eyes, like a mist being dispersed. Panic gripped him, and he stepped back, feeling the terror rising within him. The room's lights began to flicker violently, and he felt a malevolent presence approaching, an invisible force that made the air feel heavy and suffocating. John turned and ran out of the room, feeling as if something was right behind him, ready to grab him. He ran through the corridors without looking back until he finally reached the hospital's main entrance. As he stepped outside, the cold night breeze hit him, and he stopped to catch his breath, trying to process what had just happened. He knew there was no turning back. The hospital was alive in a way he could never have imagined, and now he was trapped in a deadly game with forces he could barely comprehend. But one thing was certain: Room 23 was just the beginning, and the real terror was yet to come. The dawn brought little peace to John. Even with daylight seeping through the hospital windows, the sense of imminent danger lingered over him like a persistent shadow. He had barely slept, his mind repeatedly drifting back to the terrifying encounter in Room 23 and the mysterious nurse who vanished before his eyes. The feeling of being watched never left him, even as he went about his daily tasks. The hospital's patients seemed to be in a sort of stupor, their interactions monotonous, almost automatic. John noticed that their gazes were often averted, as if they were aware of something dark and unseen lurking nearby. The following afternoon, while in a small hospital bathroom, washing his face in an attempt to shake off the exhaustion, John noticed something strange. The mirror in front of him, large and time-stained, began to show something that shouldn't be there. Instead of merely reflecting his tired face, he noticed movement in the background, as if someone were standing behind him. John froze. He hadn't heard anyone enter the bathroom, and the door was locked. Slowly, he lifted his eyes to the mirror, trying to ignore the chill running down his spine. The reflection in the glass clearly showed an indistinct figure standing behind him, a distorted shadow with no defined human form, watching his every move with malevolent intent. He quickly turned around, but the bathroom was empty. There was no one there but him. Panic began to rise in his chest, and he turned back to the mirror, hoping he had imagined it all. But the figure was still there, now more distinct, closer. It was as if the darkness itself was condensing behind him, taking shape. The outlines were vague, but there was something profoundly wrong with that image, something that didn't belong in the world of the living. Before he could react, the mirror began to crack. Thin fissures spread rapidly across the glass surface, accompanied by a high-pitched sound that sliced through the air like a scream. The cracks formed strange patterns, almost like symbols, and suddenly the glass exploded, scattering shards all over the sink and floor. John recoiled, covering his face with his arms to shield himself from the flying glass fragments. When he finally lowered his arms, the mirror was in pieces, the metal behind it exposed and cold, with no sign of the figure that had haunted him. Panting, he tried to regain his composure, but fear overwhelmed him. Whatever was haunting the hospital was becoming more aggressive, more visible, and was beginning to manifest in ways that defied any rational explanation. With still trembling hands, John collected the larger pieces of glass, tossing them into the trash. However, as he did so, something caught his eye among the shards. A small piece of paper, folded and dirty, was stuck between the fragments of glass. He picked it up, carefully unfolding it. It was a page torn from an old notebook, and the content made his heart race. Drawn by hand, in the same hurried style he had seen before, was the symbol from Santiago's diary. Beside it, a single phrase was scribbled: "They see everything through the mirror." The message was clear and frightening. The mirror had not just shown a figure. Something, or someone, was watching John back, using the reflection as a window into the real world. Whatever was lurking in that hospital now had direct access to him. Feeling nauseated and his mind spinning, John pocketed the piece of paper in his coat. He needed to think about his next steps. He couldn't continue ignoring what was happening. It was time to confront the evil permeating the hospital, or at least understand its nature. Determined, he left the bathroom and began investigating other areas of the hospital, especially those that seemed connected to the dark past he had discovered. The corridors seemed longer and more labyrinthine than before, and each step echoed ghostly, as if the very building were mocking him. As he passed by an old medicine cabinet, he saw something that made him stop. A smaller mirror, hanging precariously on the cabinet door, seemed out of place, as if it had been recently moved. The glass surface was slightly fogged, but John could see something etched on it, as if someone had run their fingers through the steam to leave a message. Approaching, he read the words that slowly appeared. "Don't trust what you see." The terror returned with full force. He was being manipulated, thrown back and forth by forces he could barely understand. The entities were toying with him, using reality itself to distort his perception. But despite the fear consuming him, John knew he had to continue. He was too involved now, and there was no escape. If there was a way to stop this, to free the hospital from its curse, he needed to find out how. But one thing was certain. From that moment on, he would avoid any mirrors. Whatever was watching him had a way to reach him, and he wasn't ready to see what might emerge from the other side. John knew the final confrontation was approaching. He could only hope he was prepared for what was to come. Night fell over the hospital once again, but this time something was different. John felt that time was behaving strangely, as if the hospital's very clock had gone mad. He looked at the wall clock in the corridor. It read 3:15 a.m., a time that seemed suspended, frozen in time, as if the world around had stopped. The feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle was suffocating. Since the mirror in the bathroom had shattered, John noticed that the hospital was transforming, as if the walls and corridors were alive, pulsing with an evil energy. The hospital had become a labyrinth of nightmares, and John knew he needed to find a way out before it was too late. Determined to understand what was happening, John returned to the morgue where he had found Dr. Santiago's diary. He felt there might be more answers buried among the old documents, something that could explain the temporal distortion he was experiencing. As he descended to the basement, the air grew heavy and dense, almost unbreathable. The lights flickered constantly, casting shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. When he reached the archive, he noticed the door was slightly ajar, as if the hospital had been waiting for him. John entered the dark, stuffy room, turning on his flashlight to illuminate the shelves full of dusty folders. He began to sift through the documents again, now with a new focus. He needed to find any mention of temporal distortion or any event similar to what he was living through. After hours of desperate searching, he finally found a note, almost hidden among the papers. It was a letter written by Dr. Santiago, but never sent. The date at the top of the letter indicated it had been written a few days before the doctor's disappearance. "Dear colleagues, I write this letter as a warning. What we started here, in this hospital, has gone beyond what we could control. It's not just physical health at stake, but reality itself. Room 23. It is the epicenter. Since we began the experiments, time seems to have lost its way within these walls. Hours repeat, nights last forever, and dawn is a promise that never comes. I fear the hospital has been corrupted by something ancient, something that was always here, waiting to be awakened. It's not just the patients who are at risk, but all of us. If you are reading this letter, I beg you, stop the experiments and seal room 23. If the cycle continues, I fear none of us will escape. With deepest regret, Dr. Albert Santiago." The letter left John with a lump in his throat. He was dealing with something beyond his understanding, something that couldn't be explained by any science he knew. The hospital had become a temporal trap, a place where time did not follow normal rules. He began to understand that the night might last forever, that he might be trapped there until he completely lost his sanity. With the letter in hand, John left the morgue, determined to try something that could reverse what was happening. He knew that room 23 was the center of it all, the point of origin for the strange events and the terror that now dominated the hospital. As he walked back through the corridors, he realized something was profoundly wrong. The same corridors seemed to repeat, as if he were walking in circles. Even changing direction several times, he always ended up in the same place, with the clock still reading 3:15. It was as if the hospital were playing with him, keeping him trapped in an endless loop. In a fit of desperation, John stopped in the middle of the corridor and screamed, his voice echoing through the empty hallways. He felt powerless, trapped in a never-ending nightmare. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows in the corners of the corridors began to move unsettlingly, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. Suddenly, he heard a familiar sound. A whisper. It wasn't the first time he had heard it, but this time it was different. The whisper seemed to come from all sides at once, a cacophony of indistinct voices, speaking words he couldn't understand. The feeling of being watched returned with full force, and John knew he was in danger. With no other choice, he decided to return to room 23, the epicenter of everything. If there was any chance of escaping that infernal cycle, it was there. Running through the corridors that now seemed to stretch infinitely, he finally reached the door to room 23. This time, the door was open, and a thick darkness emanated from within. John paused for a moment, fear enveloping him like a heavy cloak. But he knew he had no more time to waste. With one last breath, he entered the room. The darkness enveloped him immediately, and he felt the cold, dense air around him. He could hear his own heart beating, each pulse echoing in the void. When he turned on his flashlight, the light seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, barely illuminating the space in front of him. The room seemed larger inside than outside, an anomaly he was no longer surprised to see. In the back, he saw a figure, something he hadn't noticed on his previous visits. An indistinct shadow, almost like a human shape, stood there, watching him. With trembling flashlight in hand, John took a few steps toward the figure, but it didn't move. Then, suddenly, he heard the same voice he had heard on the phone, whispering his name again, but this time, it was clearer, closer. "John, you shouldn't have come back." Before he could react, the figure rushed toward him with supernatural speed, and everything around him descended into chaos. The room began to shake violently, and the walls seemed to collapse. Lights flickered, showing glimpses of disfigured faces and entities that seemed to move between spaces. John felt absolute panic take over his body, but he knew he couldn't flee. He was at the center of it all, and now he had to face the evil that had been awakened. But then, something unexpected happened. The watch on his wrist began to advance, breaking the endless 3:15 cycle. Time finally seemed to be moving again. With a last burst of courage, John raised his flashlight and ran toward the figure, determined to end it once and for all. What happened next was a blur of light and darkness, of pain and resistance. But in the end, when the morning light finally began to penetrate the hospital windows, John was alone in room 23, panting and exhausted, but alive. He looked around, seeing the remnants of what had happened. Room 23 was now destroyed, and the entities that had tormented the hospital seemed to have vanished. The watch on John's wrist read 6:20. The endless night was finally over, but he knew the scars from that encounter would stay with him forever. With one last look at the devastated room, John left, determined never to return. The hospital was still there, but he knew something fundamental had changed. And with that, he hoped perhaps the nightmares had ended too. Dawn brought a pale, cold light, but for John, there was no real relief. The São Vicente Hospital still stood, a monolith of buried pain and secrets. But now it seemed almost too quiet, as if it were regaining strength after the storm that had occurred the previous night. John walked through the hospital's devastated corridors, exhaustion weighing on him like a lead blanket. Room 23 was destroyed, but the terror he had faced still pulsed in his memory. What disturbed him most, however, was the feeling that although he had survived, the true evil had not been completely eradicated. Something deep, something at the heart of the hospital, continued to watch, waiting for the right moment to manifest again. Determined to understand the origin of everything, John decided to seek out someone who might know more about the hospital's history. He vaguely remembered an employee who had mentioned an old hospital worker, someone who had worked there for decades, even before the new wing was built. This man, known only as Old Henrique, was an almost legendary figure among the staff, known for his deep knowledge of the hospital and its darkest secrets. John found Henrique in the basement, an area of the hospital few dared to visit. The space was filled with old, discarded equipment, covered in dust and rust. Henrique was sitting on a bench, hunched over as if carrying the weight of centuries on his shoulders. His wrinkled face was a tapestry of untold stories, and his eyes, deep and penetrating, seemed to see through John. "You're the doctor who messed with room 23, aren't you?" Henrique's voice was hoarse, but it carried an authority John couldn't ignore. "Yes," John replied, feeling the weight of the words. I needed to understand what was happening. But now I feel like I've only discovered the tip of the iceberg. There's something more, isn't there? Something that's at the heart of this hospital." Henrique let out a long, heavy sigh. "What you saw in room 23 is only a fraction of what this place hides. The São Vicente Hospital was built on land that was cursed long before the first stone was laid. They say this was the site of ancient rituals where people sought to invoke powers that shouldn't have been disturbed. When the hospital was erected, those forces were sealed in the depths, but never really contained." John felt a shiver. "And Dr. Santiago? Did he know about this?" Henrique nodded slowly. "Santiago was an ambitious man. He believed he could control these forces, use them to revolutionize medicine. But he underestimated the power of what he was dealing with. His experiments opened a door that should never have been opened, and the entities he awakened, well, you've met them." "So what can we do?" John asked, feeling the desperation growing inside him. "How can we stop this?" Henrique stared intently at John, his eyes filled with deep sadness. "The heart of the evil is in the catacombs beneath the hospital. Room 23 was just the beginning. There's a hidden chamber where the original rituals were performed, and that's where the dark power still resides. If you really want to end this, that's where you need to go. But know, Doctor, that few who have descended there have returned." The idea of descending even deeper into the bowels of the hospital made John's blood run cold. However, he knew he had no choice. Whatever was at the heart of that place needed to be confronted and, if possible, destroyed. Henrique gave John precise instructions on how to reach the catacombs. "You'll find an entrance behind the abandoned chapel in the back garden. Follow the corridor to the end, and you'll find a staircase that descends into the catacombs. But be careful, John. What's down there, it's not of this world." With a mix of fear and determination, John left the basement and headed to the back garden. The morning sun illuminated the abandoned chapel, but the place exuded an aura of decay and neglect. The windows were broken, and the rotten wood creaked under his steps as he crossed the dust-covered floor. At the back of the chapel, hidden by a ruined tapestry, John found the entrance Henrique had mentioned. It was a rusty metal door, almost imperceptible at first glance. With effort, he managed to open the door, revealing a spiral staircase descending into what seemed like endless darkness. With a flashlight in hand, John began to descend. Each step seemed to echo down the stone staircase, and the temperature dropped as he went deeper. The air's humidity was suffocating, and the smell of earth and mold intensified with every meter he descended. John could feel the oppressive presence around him, as if the very air was charged with the evil energy Henrique had mentioned. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally reached the bottom of the staircase. The chamber he found was vast and cavernous, illuminated only by the flickering light of his flashlight. The walls were covered with ancient symbols, etched into the stone with disturbing precision. In the center of the chamber stood a black stone altar, stained with dried blood and surrounded by melted candles that seemed never to have been lit. John approached the altar, feeling the entity's presence around him, watching him, waiting for any sign of weakness. He knew he was in dangerous territory, but he also knew he couldn't back down now. It was then that he noticed a figure at the back of the chamber, shrouded in shadows, but clearly watching him. The air around him seemed to vibrate with a threatening energy. The figure took a step forward, revealing a familiar face. The face of Dr. Albert Santiago, but distorted, disfigured by time and the forces he had dealt with. "I failed," whispered the figure, Santiago's voice echoing through the chamber walls. "But maybe you have a chance." Before John could respond, Santiago began to disintegrate, as if being consumed by the very darkness around him. "The heart of darkness, destroy the altar before it destroys you." With those words, the figure vanished completely, leaving John alone in the chamber with the altar pulsing with dark energy. He knew what he had to do. With a final breath, John picked up a piece of stone on the ground and, with all his strength, struck the altar. The impact resonated through the chamber, and a wave of energy swept the room, almost knocking him down. He struck again and again until the altar began to crack, releasing an intense, painful light. The entities around him began to scream, a sharp, inhuman sound that reverberated in his ears. But John continued, striking the altar until it shattered into pieces, releasing an explosion of light and darkness that threw him backward. When he finally regained consciousness, the chamber was silent. The altar had been destroyed, and the oppressive presence that once filled the space had vanished. The entities that had tormented him since he began his journey seemed to have been banished, at least for now. John stood up slowly, his body aching and exhausted, but his spirit relieved. He had destroyed the heart of darkness, but he knew the São Vicente Hospital would never be the same. Still, he had done what needed to be done. With difficulty, he climbed the stairs back to the surface. When he finally emerged into the daylight, the hospital seemed almost peaceful, as if it were regaining its former tranquility. But John knew that although the evil had been weakened, the scars it left would remain forever. And he, more than anyone, would never forget what he had faced in the heart of darkness. With one last look at the hospital, John walked away, determined never to return. He knew his experiences there would mark him for the rest of his life, but he also knew that, in some way, he had managed to contain the darkness that threatened to consume everything. Now, the São Vicente Hospital was finally at peace. But John knew that true peace was always just a step away from darkness, and he had danced dangerously close to that abyss. And for that, he would never be the same. John walked away from the São Vicente Hospital with a mix of relief and exhaustion. The scars of the battle he had fought in the hospital's depths still throbbed in his mind, but he knew he had done what was necessary. The darkness that haunted the place seemed to have been contained, at least for now. However, the feeling that something was still to come did not leave him. Days passed, and John tried to return to his normal routine, but the memories of the hospital followed him wherever he went. He had recurring nightmares of the chamber in the catacombs, the broken altar, and the entities that had pursued him. Even during the day, he felt as if he were being watched, as if the shadows were still lurking, waiting for an opportunity to emerge again. One rainy afternoon, while reviewing some reports at the hospital where he now worked, something unexpected happened. One of the nurses approached him, holding a folder that seemed old, worn by time. "Dr. John, we found this in the old archives. We're not sure how it ended up there, but we thought you should take a look," she said, handing him the folder. John took the folder, feeling a chill as he touched the yellowed paper. He didn't recognize the folder, but something about it felt familiar. With a growing sense of unease, he opened the folder and found a single sheet of paper inside, written in handwriting he knew well. It was Laura's, the nurse he had met on the night it all began. The message was short but powerful. "John, if you're reading this, it means you survived. There's something you need to know. The evil we faced that night was only part of something much bigger. I couldn't tell you before, but now it's time for the truth. I'm not what you think. I was one of the first to fall under the darkness's influence, and for years I was kept here, trapped between this world and the other. When you found me that night, I was no longer alive, but I was still fighting to prevent the evil from spreading. I tried to guide you, help you, but I knew I couldn't reveal everything. The hospital, it's still alive, John, and it's always looking for a new soul to take. You may have destroyed the altar, but the true heart of the darkness is still there. It's rooted in the walls, in the foundations, and as long as the hospital exists, it will never truly be at peace. I failed to find the source, but you perhaps still can. If you decide to return, look for the place where it all began. Find the true origin, and maybe you can finally free all the souls trapped here. I'll be watching, helping as I can. But remember, the darkness never rests." Laura. John's heart raced as he read the message. Laura wasn't just an ordinary nurse. She was part of the very mystery surrounding the hospital. And even more disturbing, it seemed the battle he thought he had won was far from over. He leaned back in his chair, holding the letter with trembling hands. The revelation that Laura was a spirit trapped between two worlds shook him deeply. Everything he thought he knew had been called into question, and the feeling that the hospital still had secrets to reveal filled him with renewed fear. But along with the fear came a new determination. Laura believed that he could still find the true origin of the evil that corrupted the hospital, and John knew he couldn't ignore that. He had to go back. He had to finish what he had started. Determined to follow Laura's instructions, John began preparing his return to the São Vicente Hospital. This time, he knew the mission would be even more dangerous, but he also knew it was the only way to finally end the curse that haunted that place. He said goodbye to his colleagues at the new hospital, explaining that he needed to deal with urgent personal matters, but without revealing the dark details of his true mission. They watched him leave with worried expressions, but respected his request for privacy. When John arrived at the São Vicente Hospital, the sky was overcast, and the rain fell gently, as if the very weather were aware of what was about to happen. The building seemed darker than ever, its windows empty and dark, like eyes watching his arrival. He entered the hospital, feeling the familiar oppression of the walls closing in around him. But this time, he wasn't just trying to survive, he was searching for answers, for a definitive solution to the evil that resided there. Following the clues left by Laura, John began his search for the true origin of the darkness. He explored areas of the hospital he had previously ignored, looking for signs, for anything that could lead him to the place where it all began. Finally, in a forgotten wing, hidden in the back of the hospital, John found a secret passage concealed by a false wall. Behind it, there was a narrow, damp tunnel, descending even deeper than the catacombs he had already explored. With his heart pounding in his chest, John entered the tunnel, his flashlight trembling in his hands. The path was long and winding, and he felt the darkness around him, dense and heavy, as if he were entering the very bowels of evil. When he reached the end of the tunnel, he found a chamber even larger than the previous one, with walls covered in ancient symbols, some of which he recognized from the documents he had found before. In the center of the chamber, a deep well, emanated a cold, malevolent energy. John approached the well, feeling the air around him vibrate with the presence of something indescribable. It was there, in that well, that the true origin of the evil was hidden. It was from there that the darkness spread throughout the hospital. He knew he had to act, but wasn't sure what to do. The flashlight in his hand began to fail, the light flickering as the darkness around him seemed to close in. And then he heard Laura's voice, soft and distant. "You need to destroy it, John. Destroy the source and the hospital will be freed. But be careful. The well is protected by the souls it has taken. You'll need to face them." With those words, John felt an invisible force trying to pull him into the well, as if the lost souls were trying to prevent him from completing his mission. He fought against the force, trying to stay firm, but the voices of the spirits around him haunted him, whispering secrets of pain and despair. Knowing he couldn't win with brute force, John decided to use the one thing he had, Dr. Santiago's diary. He pulled it from his pocket, opening it to the last page, where there was an ancient prayer, one that Santiago believed could seal the darkness forever. With the voices around him growing in intensity, John began to recite the prayer aloud, each word filled with intention and desperation. The chamber began to tremble, and the walls seemed to writhe as he continued, the flashlight flickering furiously. As John uttered the final words, an explosion of light emanated from the well, illuminating the entire chamber with blinding intensity. The voices of the spirits turned into screams, and then, slowly, were silenced. The darkness around him began to dissipate, like mist being swept away by the wind. When the light finally faded, the hospital was silent. The well was sealed, and the oppressive feeling had disappeared. John knew that, finally, he had succeeded. The true origin of the evil had been destroyed, and the São Vicente Hospital was finally free of its curse. Exhausted, he left the tunnel and climbed back to the surface. The sky was clearing, and the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds, bathing the hospital in a soft, peaceful light. John looked at the building one last time, knowing that while the scars of the battle remained, he had completed his mission. He turned and began to walk toward the horizon, with the sense that, despite everything, he had finally found peace. But deep in his mind, he knew that darkness never completely disappears. It just hides, waiting for the right moment to return. And he would be ready if that moment came again. The morning sun was beginning to light up the horizon as John walked away from the São Vicente Hospital, his mind still immersed in the terrible events he had just experienced. He believed that he had finally freed the hospital from the curse that haunted it, but a sense of unease lingered in his chest, like a shadow that refused to disappear. As he walked down the deserted road leading away from the hospital, John felt a presence behind him. Initially, he thought it was just a remnant of his fear, a natural reflex after what he had faced. However, the feeling of being watched intensified, becoming impossible to ignore. He stopped, quickly turning to see what might be following him, but there was nothing but the empty road and the distant hospital. The air was eerily still, with no sound of birds or wind. The only thing John could hear was the sound of his own breathing, fast and irregular. Trying to convince himself that he was just paranoid, John continued walking, quickening his pace. However, the feeling of pursuit persisted, growing stronger. He could feel a dark presence approaching, as if the darkness itself were taking shape and following him. Suddenly, he heard a noise behind him, a low sound, almost imperceptible, like a whisper. Terror gripped him, and John began to run, adrenaline propelling him forward. His footsteps echoed on the road as he desperately tried to escape whatever was following him. The scenery around him seemed to distort, as if reality were fragmenting. The trees on either side of the road became indistinct blurs, and the distance between him and the hospital seemed to stretch infinitely. No matter how fast he ran, it seemed that the hospital never left his sight. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something moving in the shadows. A thin, deformed figure, made of darkness itself, was approaching quickly. John knew he couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, he would have to face whatever was pursuing him. With his heart pounding in his ears, he decided to stop and turn around, facing the approaching figure. The dark presence stopped a few meters away, its features indistinct and shrouded in shadows. Even so, John felt a wave of absolute terror as he looked at it. The entity emanated an ancient malevolence, something he knew was far beyond human comprehension. The figure extended a skeletal hand toward him, and John felt an invisible force gripping him, as if trying to pull him into the darkness. He fought against the pressure, trying to stay firm, but the force was immense, almost irresistible. Desperate, John remembered Laura's words, that evil was never completely destroyed, only contained. He needed to use what he had learned to protect himself, to banish the entity before it was too late. With all his strength, John began to recite the prayer he had used to destroy the altar in the underground chamber. His voice was shaky at first, but as he continued, it grew stronger. The dark figure hesitated for a moment, and John felt the pressure on him lessen slightly. He continued the prayer, his voice now firmer, as if each word were a blade cutting through the darkness. The entity began to writhe, as if it were being burned by the sacred words. The darkness around it began to dissipate, revealing a figure that seemed to disintegrate before his eyes. With a piercing scream, the entity retreated, trying to flee from the light now emanating from John's words. In one final effort, he uttered the prayer's last words, and the figure dissolved completely, leaving behind only silence and the empty road. John collapsed to his knees, exhausted and panting. The immediate danger had passed, but he knew that the evil inhabiting the São Vicente Hospital was still lurking, waiting for a new opportunity to manifest. When he finally managed to stand, John noticed that the hospital was now out of sight, hidden by the distant hills and trees. He knew he couldn't keep running from his shadow, but he also knew he needed to find a way to prevent the darkness from returning. Determined to understand more about what he had faced, John began walking again, this time with a clear objective in mind. He would seek help, find people who could explain what was happening and, if necessary, return to the hospital for a final battle. But above all, he knew he needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Because deep down, John knew that the pursuit wasn't over yet. The evil was wounded, but not defeated, and now he was its primary target. The exhaustion weighing on John was not just physical, it was a mental and emotional drain, a constant weariness that had been accumulating since the moment he set foot in the São Vicente Hospital. He had survived the pursuit of the dark entity, but he knew that was not the end. The evil he had faced was deep, ancient, and far from being completely eradicated. As he continued his journey, with the hospital now distant in his view, John felt an increasing urgency to find answers. He knew that if he wanted to defeat the evil that inhabited the hospital definitively, he would need help. He decided to seek out an old college friend, Marina, who had become an expert in ancient rituals and folklore. If anyone could help him understand what was happening, it would be her. Marina lived in a small coastal town, several hours' drive away. John headed there, all the while feeling the presence of darkness as a constant shadow in his mind. When he finally arrived at Marina's house, he was greeted with a warm hug, but she soon noticed the weight John was carrying. "You're different, John. Something happened, didn't it?" Marina asked, looking at him with concern. John nodded, explaining in detail everything that had occurred at the São Vicente Hospital. The entities, room 23, the well in the catacombs, and the pursuit that had almost cost him his life. Marina listened attentively, not interrupting, absorbing every word. "I knew the hospital had a dark history, but I didn't imagine it was this deep," she said thoughtfully. What you faced there is much older than anything we can easily comprehend. It seems the hospital was built on a confluence of dark energies, fueled by ancient rituals and forces that go beyond this world. I destroyed the altar and bathed the well in light, but I feel it wasn't enough, John responded, frustration evident in his voice. The evil is still there, and it seems to be following me. What else can I do? Marina looked at him seriously. There's one last thing that can be done, but it's extremely dangerous. If you're sure the evil is still alive, it's possible it's tied to an incomplete ritual, something that wasn't finished, and that's trapped in a cycle, waiting to be completed. An incomplete ritual, John repeated, trying to understand. Yes, Marina confirmed. In some cases, when a ritual is interrupted or done incorrectly, it can get stuck in time, trapped between this world and the next. That could explain why the entities in the hospital are so persistent. If you can find what remains of that ritual and destroy it completely, you might finally be able to free the place. But how do I do that? Where do I start? John asked, feeling the weight of the task. Marina sighed. You need to go back to the hospital, John. You need to go to the place where it all began and look for signs of an old ritual, something that was left behind. But know that by doing this, you'll be entering dangerous territory. The forces protecting this ritual won't let you undo it easily. John felt a chill down his spine hearing this, but he knew he had no choice. I'll do whatever it takes, he said determinedly. I can't let this continue. Marina nodded and began to prepare some items to help him. Protective amulets, sacred herbs, and a small ceremonial dagger, all carefully wrapped in linen cloths. These items will help protect you and fight off anything that tries to stop you. But above all, you'll need courage, John, because what you'll face won't be easy. With the preparations made, John said goodbye to Marina and prepared for the long journey back to the São Vicente Hospital. As he drove, the road seemed darker, as if the world around him were bracing for what was to come. The darkness seemed denser, more oppressive, and John knew that the evil was aware of his return. When he arrived at the hospital, the full moon was high in the sky, casting a cold, pale light over the building. The hospital looked even more sinister than before, its windows dark like dead eyes, watching his arrival. John entered the hospital with the protective amulets around his neck and the ceremonial dagger firmly strapped to his belt. The air was dense, almost suffocating, and the silence was total, broken only by the sound of his own footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. He knew where he needed to go, back to the catacombs, where the well and the chamber had been found. Marina had given him instructions on how to identify the signs of an incomplete ritual, and he felt more prepared, but also more fearful than ever. As he descended the stone stairs, the temperature dropped, and the darkness closed in around him, as if the hospital were collapsing upon him. When he finally reached the underground chamber, he felt the presence of evil as a crushing pressure on his chest. The well was still there, but something was different. As he approached, John saw that the floor around the well was covered with ancient symbols, drawn in dried blood and surrounded by extinguished candles. The markings were complex, intertwined, forming a circle that seemed to pulse with dark energy. With trembling hands, John knelt beside the symbols, trying to decipher what he was seeing. Marina had said that an incomplete ritual always left signs, symbols indicating that the work hadn't been finished, that something was missing. And there, at the center of the circle, he saw what was missing. A figure drawn halfway, as if someone had been interrupted before completing the drawing. At that moment, he knew what he needed to do. Grabbing the ceremonial dagger, John cut his palm, letting the blood drip onto the incomplete symbol. The fresh blood mixed with the old drawing, and he felt the chamber tremble around him. Suddenly, the candles around the circle lit up, casting a supernatural light over the chamber. The well began to emit a deep sound, almost like a moan, and the shadows on the walls stirred, taking grotesque shapes. John recited the prayer Marina had taught him, each word filled with power and determination. He knew he needed to complete the ritual, not in the way the ancients intended, but to destroy it once and for all. As the sacred words left his mouth, he felt the resistance of the entities, as if they were trying to choke his words. But John continued, his voice growing in intensity as the candles burned with blinding light. He felt the presence of lost souls around him, screaming in agony, but also saw a light in the depths of the darkness, the presence of Laura, who seemed to guide him, helping him stay focused. When John uttered the final words of the ritual, the chamber was engulfed in an explosion of light that threw him backward. He felt the force of the entities being ripped from the place, as if they were being sucked into the well. The ground shook violently, and the candles were extinguished instantly. When the light finally disappeared, silence fell over the chamber. John opened his eyes and saw that the symbols had vanished, and the well was sealed, as if it had never existed. The malevolent pressure had vanished, and he knew that the ritual had finally been completed. Exhausted, John stood up with difficulty, his body aching and his mind dazed. He had succeeded. The macabre ritual had been undone, and the evil that had infested the São Vicente Hospital for so long had been banished. The entities were freed, and the hospital could finally rest in peace. As he left the catacombs and climbed back to the surface, John felt the night breeze on his face and looked at the starry sky. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He knew that while evil might exist elsewhere, he had done his part to bring light where there was once only darkness. With one last look at the hospital, John smiled slightly and began his walk home. The São Vicente Hospital was now at peace, and he knew his mission there was complete. Whatever the future might bring, he was ready to face it. After all, he had faced the very heart of darkness, and won. Months passed since the last time John set foot in the São Vicente Hospital. The memory of the events he faced in that dark place began to fade, but the scars it left on his soul remained, a constant reminder of what he had lived through. Life returned to normal, or at least what could be considered normal, after facing primordial evil. John decided to move to a small coastal town, far from the shadows of the past, where the sound of the waves and the salty breeze could calm his troubled mind. He dedicated himself to medicine more peacefully, attending to a local community that welcomed him with open arms, without questioning his past. Despite leaving the São Vicente Hospital behind, John couldn't completely shake the memories of the place. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, he still felt a presence watching him, a slight shadow at the edge of his peripheral vision. But whenever he turned his head, there was nothing but emptiness. Marina, his friend and confidant, kept in touch with him, worried about the impact that battling the dark forces might have had on his mind. They exchanged letters and messages, discussing the nature of the evil John had faced and how he could move forward. It was in one of these letters that Marina wrote something that remained etched in John's mind. What you faced at the São Vicente Hospital was more than just a simple curse. It was a test, proof that darkness can be fought, but never completely eradicated. There are forces in this world that operate beyond our understanding, and all we can do is stay vigilant. The hospital is at peace now, but you, more than anyone else, know that darkness always finds a new home. Take care of yourself, John. The world still needs people like you, those willing to face the unknown to protect others, but never forget to protect yourself too. Marina's words were comforting, but also a warning. John knew that despite winning the battle, the war against the evil lurking in the shadows never truly ends. There would be other places, other souls in danger, and perhaps someday he would be called upon again to act. One night, while watching the sun set over the sea, John felt an inner peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. He knew he had fulfilled his mission at the São Vicente Hospital, that the tormented souls had finally found rest. But he also knew that the experience had changed him forever. As the last ray of sun disappeared on the horizon, John stood up and returned to his small seaside house. Life went on, and he was determined to live it fully, enjoying every moment of tranquility he had earned. In the depths of his soul, however, he was prepared for the day when darkness might rise again, somewhere far away, or perhaps closer than he imagined. He had faced the worst and emerged victorious, but he knew he must never completely lower his guard. And so, while the world around him followed its natural course, John lived his life with the serenity of someone who had faced his demons, and who, if necessary, would do it again. Because in a world where evil can hide in the deepest shadows, there is always a need for someone willing to face it. John was that person, and he was at peace with that.